Over the years, you have certainly been consistent in stating that competing centers of analysis and interpretation within the intelligence community is superior to centralization. And you've also observed that centralization would probably be quixotic or impossible because the centers, various competing centers, would surreptitiously go back to their status quo or something close to it, even if there was an attempt to foist centrality upon it. And I think that's a very interesting observation, and one which obviously we need to take note of, because we live not in a theoretical world, but a practical world. But having said that, when you have these competing centers of intelligence analysis and interpretation, would you agree that there is a concomitant impulse to protect and husband that intelligence analysis within each of these competing centers? And I see you nodding. Is that consistent with your experience?
It is, and it must be resisted.
But once you have these sort of practical issues of protecting turf and thereby protecting the substance of intelligence analysis, it occurs to me and perhaps others on this commission that although there was a significant amount of intelligence collected prior to 9/11, this very same desire to protect and concomitant resistance to share intelligence seemed to be a substantial contributing factor in the failure to prevent the 9/11 disaster. And I'd like to get your comments on that observation.
The biggest source of so-called intelligence failures are axioms that grip the political community. Axioms that grip the political community and infiltrate, as it were, affect intelligence estimates. And for that reason, the prevailing wisdom in intelligence has to be resisted. When I was DCI, however briefly, I was going to set up a division of devil's advocacy within the Central Intelligence Agency, so that whenever there was a prevailing view such as the Soviet Union will stop producing missiles at 1,000, ICBMs at 1,000, because all they want to do is to match us. There was another view, which is that the Soviet Union might want to exceed our production, our deployment. And so you need to have devil's advocacy within the system, and you need to institutionalize that within each agency. Now, what you describe is in part the result of the hearings in the mid-1970s. Remember that it was the Congress that held those hearings and wanted to establish a wall between intelligence and the law enforcement community, such that the FBI could not draw on CIA information. Since 9/11, we've knocked down that wall, but the tendency to stay within organizations has in part been driven by the legislation and the rules that came out of the 1970s. We are breaking down some of those barriers. Within the intelligence community, narrowly defined, we have now something called Intel Link. And what Intel Link has done has been to to weaken, though not eliminate, the baronies to which you refer. We need to go further. One of the problems is the attitude of indifference to certain information rather than the desire to hold that information within the organization. Take, for example, the report of the FBI agent out in Phoenix. It wasn't that the FBI felt that was so valuable that that was a nugget that had to be retained and not shared with anybody else. It was, that's a small matter. You know, let's get on with fighting crime and disregard that. So a lot of this is a problem of insufficient attention to what is really relevant. And I think that this can in part be, what you described can be in part achieved by better scrutiny over the entire flow of intelligence, picking out those things that appear to be relevant to the current problem, even though you recognize that there's some future problem down the road that will be relevant, but you don't know what it should be.
Well, I appreciate that analysis, Dr. Schlesinger. You've raised in the course of that a number of important issues. Would you not agree that having some central form of receipt of analytical information would go a long way toward remedying the inherent problems in these baronies, as you put it so colorfully? In addition, you have touched on an issue relating to what I would regard as analysis and interpretation within our domestic intelligence gathering apparatus, the FBI. And the combination of those two, I think, speaks again to the issue of improving our analysis and interpretation mechanism, and to put that information into the right hands for prevention, which is now, since 9/11, obviously reared itself as an important second priority of the FBI, beside their primary goal of law enforcement. And so, could you comment, based on your experience, in whether you feel there is a need on the analytical and interpretation side within our domestic intelligence gathering apparatus to improve or in some way differentiate between the law enforcement functions of the FBI and the analytical functions of domestic intelligence interpretation?
It is not only in the world of terrorism, it is, of course, not only domestic. There is the interweaving of intelligence that comes from overseas with what we gather domestically. One of the problems that occurred from the legislation in the 1970s was that although the Central Intelligence Agency was set up to gather all information, after the changes of the 1970s, the FBI was precluded from turning to the CIA, and that led to some of the problems that we saw with respect to the two terrorists who were in Kuala Lumpur. I overstate when I say that the FBI was not into analysis. They didn't do analysis. Organizations are bureaucracies. You go to the place, you go to the functions, to the specialties within an organization in which you will have promotions. In the FBI prior to 9/11, as I recall it, you could soar all the way up to GS11 if you were in analysis. That was not the way to attract the best talent. And analysis tended to be to confirm that General Motors, where is General Motors headquartered, would come a question from the special agent in charge out in Paducah, and the answer will come back from the analytical shop. General Motors is headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. I think that it's changing. I think that the director is working hard at changing, but he has got to create an analytical frame of mind within an organization that has not been strong in that area.
So you would recommend, I take it, that if the intelligence analysis function is to remain within the FBI, that there be a separate form of promotion and a professional cadre of analysts within the FBI who would be promoted on criteria that is much different
from those of the past,
from those criteria used for promoting the law enforcement side of the FBI.
Well, they have to have an opportunity, a serious opportunity to rise within the organization. It's the same way that it was in the military services. If you spent too much time in joint commands in the past, your chances for promotion were modest.
And would you agree that in the recruitment effort in getting the best and the brightest analysts possible, that the criteria might be substantially different than the recruiting criteria traditionally for law enforcement agents?
Yes, sir.
Slade.
Senator Good.
Thank you, sir.
Certainly leads to my question. Jim, in one trenchant sentence, which regrettably you don't follow up, you say, I would submit that the real challenge is recruiting, fostering, and motivating the right people. What suggestions do you have for accomplishing or reaching that goal?
That in itself is not an easy question. One has got to move away from narrow expertise and to convey the broader picture of the new environment in which the United States finds itself as a result of the global war on terrorism. It is a substantially different environment. No longer can you focus on being the leading authority on Soviet deployment of the SS-9 or SS-18 missile. Country expertise, to which I referred here, is in a sense too narrow, because terrorism spreads beyond many of the countries in the Muslim world. And as I indicate, even though at the moment we are responding tactically to many of these problems, I don't think that we have a sufficiently good strategic framework of the overall problem of terrorism, a problem that stems from a civil war that is going on within the Muslim world, and which, partly for reasons of political correctness here in the United States, we tend to blur somewhat. So I think that you have to have people that you protect. And as I mention in here, when analysts read in the paper every day how they've failed and so forth, they begin to get risk averse. It's important that we have straight talk from the analysts and that we protect them in a way that they do not become risk averse. I'm not sure that I've fully answered that question, Senator, but
It is an aspiration that is not easy to achieve, but let me go to a second question. A good deal of the public inquiry, reflected in this commission, has to do with the so-called question of connecting the dots. In your view, from all of your reading and expertise in this area, was the failure to anticipate and prevent 9/11 a failure to connect the dots that were available, or were there too few dots? And if the former, would a different organization have resulted in connecting the same dots that we had in a way that was more productive and constructive?
Well, thank you for that question. I have here a diagram that shows a large number of dots of different hues. And the problem, Senator, is not that we have too few dots, but that there are too many dots and that we cannot identify which of them is significant. In retrospect, it is easy to identify the significant dots. I've got here Mohammed Atta, one-way tickets, paid cash, 4 Arab-looking men in aisle seats. In retrospect, since we know what happened, we can select amongst the various dots, and we will be able to identify those that were important, and if we had known they were important before, we could have taken action. The problem, the challenge, is to find means of highlighting these areas, those that were significant. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. And I don't believe that the intelligence community is sufficiently focused on some of the cheaper ways in SIGINT, cellular phones, and so forth, that would be of help in this area of highlighting what is a countless set of dots.
But was that an organizational failure or a failure of imagination?
It's both. It's both. Imagination is a precious and rare commodity, and we need to understand that within any organization, that those who presently have the resources like it that way, and they don't like to sacrifice those resources because somebody comes up with what he thinks is an imaginative idea. That is the responsibility of leadership, to find those areas, in this case, of new technologies. We are spending billions up there on new satellites. And some of the things that we could be doing to highlight these areas, I believe, can be achieved through tens of millions of dollars. But as your question implies, we have to recognize them. Let me go back to your initial question, if I may, Senator. I thought that we did not connect the dots before 9/11 in particular, and I said this at the time. This is not a retrospective view. We had the seizure of that French aircraft. We had the episode in Manila in which there was the plan to blow up 10 or 11 American airliners coming out of the Far East, and included as a throwaway line to take an aircraft and to drive it into the headquarters of the CIA in Langley, Virginia. Now, I think that should have gotten more attention at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, than may have been the case. That certainly should be an attention grabber. It is plain that they were thinking in terms of using aircraft in this way. In general, the problem remains that there are many, many dots out there. And it is one of the effects of the criticism that has gone on of the intelligence community is that analysts have become more risk averse. And so instead of evaluating these dots and saying, well, that comes from an incredible source and we can disregard it, or we should pay less attention to it, they are saying, suppose that source, even though he's got a very poor record of credibility, turns out to have been right, then my job is on the line. So pass along all the dots to the highest authority. That gets to be a problem.
Well, with respect, each one of the dots, each one of the incidents to which you refer was generally and publicly known before 9/11.
Yes.
Did you anticipate or fear this kind of attack? Did anyone of like experience with you outside government that you know of do so?
Did I anticipate that? I thought that it was not unlikely, given what had happened, particularly in Manila, given, as you will recall, the episode with the Egyptian aircraft and so forth. I don't think, in retrospect, we should have been surprised. You say that in 1971 you recommended against the creation of a director of national intelligence. Is that still your view? Yes, sir.
You also say that you urged the DCI be given greater authority over the entire intelligence community. You implied that took place during the Nixon administration. Is it still desirable to increase that authority?
It has been an evolution. It started, at that time, the DCI had control of about 15% of the intelligence budget. And therefore there was tension, as the previous question suggested. There was tension within elements of the community, in that, to take one clear example, the NSA did not like to be directed by people from the Central Intelligence Agency. And we had to break that down. Otherwise, and let me say also that at that time, the people who were running the intelligence community staff, virtually all were drawn from the clandestine services. Clandestine services provide you with many insights, but they do not necessarily provide you with the best insight with respect to SIGINT. And so there was legitimate resistance on the part of the NSA, as well as institutional resistance. We moved slowly in that direction. It went up. Sometimes it receded. I think that the DCI has substantial authority now, the necessary authority. If it is pushed too hard, if he pushes that authority too hard, he will run into resistance, first from the military services, then from the NSA, then from the Secretary of Defense, or perhaps in the reverse order.
Do you are you aware of the recommendations that John Deutsch is going to make as our next witness?
I'm not specifically aware.
All right, let me share what I consider the heart of them and ask for your comments on them. He, as I read his testimony, is going to recommend that the DCI be given executive authority for domestic intelligence activities. That is to say that the DCI will, in effect, be in charge of that portion of the FBI that is now dealing with domestic intelligence activities, just as he has control over the CIA today. What is your reaction to that recommendation?
My reaction is the DCI is a pretty busy man already. I would approach that with great caution. I think that we now have an experiment, and these experiments, as it were, take considerable period of time to reach fruition. We have the director of the FBI attempting to move in the right direction with regard to improving analytical activities within analytical intelligence activities within that agency. To disrupt it now, I think, might be a mistake. We will see. Perhaps more significant, it has been the suggestion, which I'm not yet ready to endorse, that we create an MI5 in this country, which in effect takes that intelligence function away from the FBI. I don't think we should not do that as yet, but we should consider it as an alternative. And I think that that may be a more effective way than simply handing over the intelligence functions of the FBI to the DCI. Over the years, we have had, what shall I say, an interesting history of relations between the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI. When J. Edgar Hoover was director, he had instructed his people not to talk to the people in the CIA. Well, that was a prime example, I think, of the baronies. I should add that despite that directive from the director, that the people in the agency understood that they had to talk to each other, so that they did that surreptitiously.
One more question, Mr. Schlesinger. The investigations and the resulting reforms from the Church Committee, in your view, did they improve our intelligence capabilities, derogate from them? Were they neutral? Or if they derogated from them, did they have other values which made them worthwhile? What is your general view of the aftermath of that dramatic set of changes?
Well, I think that in the large, that they probably were detrimental. I think that it was useful to point to certain activities that had been going on, but that particularly on the House side rather than the Senate side, that the investigations got out of hand, that far more was revealed in those investigations than it was desirable to reveal, and that some of the legislation and rules that evolve from it have not been helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Benvenisti.
Dr. Schlesinger, another recommendation that has been discussed is to invest in a director of national intelligence, certain authorities over budget, many of which you've mentioned that now reside within the Pentagon, and now you see the director of CIA who has obligations with respect to running that agency, and nominally is supposed to direct traffic in terms of where intelligence resources go, but has no actual authority because he does not control the budget. 80% or so of the intelligence budget is held within the Department of Defense. What would your reaction be? And I know you have expressed over the years the injunction against emulating kiddie soccer whenever there's a crisis where all the kids run to the ball. And mindful of that, however, and in view of this very significant change in the intelligence needs of this country after the Cold War, what would your view be about a director of national intelligence who was disassociated from running a particular agency, had no troops, but yet had budget allocation authorities to direct how the enormous amount of money that's spent on intelligence is allocated?
Well, he would be without troops, and he would be essentially another special assistant or to the president, and he will. There is always a temptation to try to move things towards the White House, and the White House is better at setting overall policy than running operations, and only a limited number of operations can be run from the White House. I think that you really want to keep that back in the agencies and the departments. I would add that the President proposes, the Congress disposes, that it is the Congress that will decide on the level of appropriations for various intelligence activities, and that these appropriations may or may not be used or may be amplified for the purposes prescribed. The NRO, to take an example, I would not like to see the Air Force begin to lose its interest in running the NRO because the authority over the NRO has been shifted off someplace else. I think that one has to be very careful, once again, in motivating the people who are actually doing the work. If the NRO, which has over the years drawn very qualified Air Force officers, were suddenly to be an orphan of the Air Force, that would not be desirable for that particular arm of the intelligence community. And the consequence would be that you would draw in fewer capable people. And I think that that is more or less inevitable. It is now some 40 years since I wrote a paper on how you had to motivate agencies and institutions to do what you want to do. Simply handing down directives usually runs into considerable resistance.
Well, you have been very articulate in expressing all of the things that shouldn't be done to change. Where do you come out in terms of your recommendations of what should be done?
Well, the first point, once again, is that management changes can be helpful, but they should be a result of modest adjustment rather than gross surgery. Gross surgery that probably, unless it is very carefully conceived in advance, probably does more harm than good for an extended period, simply because you've shaken up all of these institutions. People are wondering who's in charge and whatever the formal organization chart. So adjustments, build up the counterterrorism work, draw better people into it, set up a special group that would deal with establishing a conceptual framework for a conceptual strategic framework for dealing with the terrorism problem, which we have not as yet, I believe, thought through. Those are the kinds of things. Recruit better people and protect them. It is the real problem is the quality of intelligence. When the CIA was started, when the intelligence community was started, there was a greater tendency in the intelligence community to go outside and to find what were regarded as the best minds in the country. That has diminished, and I think that there ought to be encouragement, greater encouragement to go out and find some of the people. There's too much of talking to each other and not talking to the people out there. Just take an example. There was, I think, insufficient contact with the people in the oil industry with regard to the ferment in the Middle East. These people are out there. They know what's going on. They know what's going on better than somebody sitting in his cubicle at Langley or in the DIA. And there needs to be more outreach, it seems to me. There is an outreach program. It has always been there, but it has become more and more formalistic, debriefing people who visited Baghdad since 1995 or what have you.
Thank you, sir.
Let me add that I don't think, given what they had, that the analysts did too badly with regard to the issues of weapons of mass destruction. The real problem is that with all the commerce that has gone on in Iraq, that we were unable to get agents in who would tell us what was going on in the country.
Commissioner Fielding and then Commissioner Gorelick.
Dr. Schlesinger, can you turn on the mic, please?
Is that better? Thank you very much for appearing here today and for your government service over the years. You have to bear with us. We have to analyze something that you've thought about for years and years. And what we're trying to do is, in fulfilling our mandate, come up with a recommendation of what changes, if any, should be done. So if we're asking questions that seem a little mundane or a little off the wall, it's because we're searching. One of the issues Richard just touched upon is something that is confusing to me as well, and that is dealing with budgetary authorities, that sort of thing. And I noted that you gave some testimony in 1972 in which you said, be careful of those who are paying for the intelligence, who are paying the intelligence analysts. That if, and the example you cited was if the CIA was paying for the analysts, then the Secretary of State, or at least the Foreign Service, would probably look askance at the information. They would deem that to be penetration. And you stated that you were concerned that the DCI might have difficulty effectively executing budget authority outside of his ambit. In that regard, I guess I have two questions. If the Director of National Intelligence is created, or if the Director of CIA is given greater authority over the intelligence agencies within the various departments of defense, et cetera, should each department continue to pay for its own analysts and its own intelligence? And a follow-up to that is there an effective way to centralize authority of our counterintelligence agencies, though they're located in different departments and different subsets, without creating too much tension, again, due to budgetary control issues?
Let me deal with that second question first. Yes, I think we need to think long and hard about mechanisms for greater cohesion within the counter-terrorism effort, simply because we have not thought about it very much in the past, and that it has been, at least for some agencies, a secondary effort. And so now that the global war on terrorism is the central priority of American foreign policy, we need to think better how to bring together these elements that are dealing with the counterterrorism issue. So I think that that indeed is the case. Now, as to your earlier part of your question, this goes back to that need for competition. I note that in the press and amongst members of Congress, there has been great enthusiasm expressed that the Department of State took a footnote, if that was what it was, in the recent NIE, October 2002, saying that they didn't see that there was all that much evidence that there was weapons of mass destruction. I think that you need to have that kind of ferment going on, and protecting that source of special information for the Secretary of State is highly desirable. It took us years to break down the resistance of what were then called sinks to making use of the very costly satellites that we are utilizing, because they were national intelligence and they weren't under the sink's direct control. I think that we have shown that those national assets can be responsive to the needs of the sinks, now the combatant commanders, and that as a result they welcome this source of information not under their direct control. But I read in the press about allegations, at least, that the Department of Defense set up a special entity to examine certain aspects of our Middle Eastern problem. I think that may have been exaggerated. The press does exaggerate from time to time. But it does point to the fact that when an agency head is disappointed with the quality of information that he's getting, he is going to find some way of setting up, in effect, his additional sources of intelligence under his guidance. I'm not sure that I answered your question.
No, you have. Thank you.
Dr. Schlesinger, I'd like to follow up on Slade Gordon's question. He asked you whether there was a failure of imagination or a failure of organization, and you essentially responded there was a failure of leadership, and I personally would add a failure of urgency.
I think I said there was both.
Yes, both, and you added leadership. My question is an organizational one, and I know you've warned us against organizational changes, but I'm having trouble squaring that with the observations in your testimony. Right now, we have a situation where there is no accountability for the entire government's intelligence, except in the person of the President of the United States and the National Security Advisor as his aide. And my question to you is, how do you get the organization, the imagination, the leadership, the urgency, if you haven't invested someone with authority to move resources to where they need to go? You say in your testimony, you're not going to get the resources away from a certain agency that has them, the Defense Department, to the place where they might be needed at the observation of the DCI, for example, who doesn't have them, because the Secretary of Defense is not going to part with them. We are faced with that. We have to remedy that. We have to address that. You've sat in both places, as has Dr. Deutsch, from whom we'll hear in a few minutes. You know that as Secretary of Defense, if you wanted resources to stay put, they stayed put in your agency. And you know when you were DCI, if you wanted them from the Secretary of Defense in that battle, you were likely to come out the loser. So my question to you is, what are we supposed to make of that? How do we remedy the fact that there is no accountability anywhere in the government for the intelligence product right now, except at the presidential level?
I think that the DCI has responsibility for the intelligence product. That the president does not deal with producing intelligence. The president has got too many other things on his mind. And the DCI is the advisor to the National Security Council, which presumably does these allocations. Now, the example that I cited was not the unwillingness of Department X to give up resources to Agency Y. It was within Agency Y, it is difficult to reallocate resources under a budget constraint simply because the resistance to taking away resources from the other established entities is too fierce. And it is, as your question implies, even more fierce when you cross agency lines. I don't know, I do not know that this issue has a resolution. It is that we will just have to cope with it. And George Shultz, when he was here, when he used to describe what is the function of government, is to cope with the same damned issue day after day, month after month. We aren't going to resolve the budget issues. Budgets are the heart of government's policy, and conceptually we can put somebody in charge and he will allocate here and there and so forth, and you do not know after you've put that somebody in charge what the consequences will be of that allocation, whether you will be able to retain good people or recruit good people in the NRO, an example I cited earlier. So conceptually, you are suggesting that we have some overall intelligence, not in the technical sense, that deals with the allocation problem and far-seeingly allocates resources. I don't think that you're going to be able to achieve that.
Because of the politics of it, because of the oversight. I mean, we had a situation in which the DCI literally was pounding on tables all over town saying, in February of 2001, saying, we have a very big problem here. This issue of al-Qaeda and particularly threats to the United States had skyrocketed to the top of his attention, and yet we don't see what the follow-up was. We don't see the urgency. And the question is, how do you get that? Is there an organizational way to address it? Obviously, that is not all that you would do, but it strikes me anyway that simply saying, well, this is what we've got, is quite frankly not a sufficient answer.
The agency has much of the analytical talent of the intelligence community. And the director of and as I mentioned earlier, the analytical question is the heart of the problem. The director presumably is able to influence the analytical effort. In the case that you cited, my recollection is, at least according to the press, that after we pounded the table, that we wound up with 5 people working on the al-Qaeda problem prior to 9/11. You know, it's, if you want to deal with a problem, this country is at war, that is a major threat, all of which was right, and all of which the director said, and he didn't get the support or understanding, as your question implies, that he should have gotten, but still, there was a minimal effort directed towards the al-Qaeda problem, and that is something that could have been handled within the agency.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very, very much. I know there are commissioners who have additional questions, 3 or 4 of them. We've simply got to move on because of our time constraints. But I want to thank you very, very much, Mr. Secretary. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.